This tutorial is going to cover some of my personal favorite Photoshop tools for editing and corrections, so if you're interested in that, keep watching. Starting out, let's talk about Photoshop's Content-Aware Fill tool. Content-Aware Fill is a really good tool for editing things out of a part of a picture that you don't want in them anymore. Content-Aware Fill works on selected areas of a single image. Once you have the area you want to fill selected, go up into your Edit menu and down to Content-Aware Fill to start using it. You have a few different options to choose from in this menu: Auto, Rectangular, and Custom, which you can see on the right hand side here. Auto is going to try to fill the area selected with what's around it, which can cause it to throw some stuff in you don't want if things are too close. Rectangular can run into the same issue as you can see, so we're going to use Custom for this, which is going to fill based on a selection you make using the brush tool. Since the area I want it to fill the selection in with is the fence, that's what I'm going to start drawing in. You can already see it working better by doing it this way, but it seems to be a bit confused about the rotation since there's such a big gap for it to fill. This can easily be fixed up with the rotation adaptation drop down on the right. The higher you set this, the better it's going to adapt to the proper rotation, so keep that in mind. You have a few other things to choose from the right as well if you needed to. I'm going to set this to full and leave it at that. You can choose to have this saved to a new layer above yours or directly on this layer. When you're done, just press OK. This is more than enough for a good fill, and any other edits can be easily done with the liquify menu or other tools at this point. Now let's go over another tool Photoshop uses this type of fill with, called the Content Aware Move tool. This tool is going to be in a different place depending on what workspace you have your Photoshop in. If you're using the default Essentials workspace, then this tool is going to be to your left here. If you're using the painting workspace, then this tool is shoved all the way at the bottom of this list and crammed in with everything else down here. Personally, I use the default Essentials workspace with custom tweaks, so that's why mine looks the way it does. Anyway, this tool is great to use if you have parts of an image you want to move around, but you don't want to have to deal with repainting gaps or cleaning too much stuff up afterwards. Content Aware Move lets you make a selection and move that selection around while using the same type of Content Aware Fill shown earlier to reconstruct any gaps left over from the move. Because it's using Content Aware to fill the gaps, you sometimes get the same issues, but this can easily be fixed with another Content Aware tool known as the Spot Healing Brush. The Spot Healing Brush lets you draw over areas and minor gaps and will do its best to correct and rematch it to its surroundings. This tool is a lifesaver and I honestly use it all the goddamn time. There's also a clone stamp tool in this menu that will let you clone and paint those areas on, but I never use it so I'm not going over it. Moving on in the list, the most OP correction editing tool Photoshop has to offer, the liquify menu. This works both with a selection or with a layer and is located up in the top filter menu drop down. When this loads up, there's a lot to look at because there's a lot that you can do with it. Anything that you do with the brush is going to depend on your brush settings on the top right here. This is going to affect how much, how hard, or how little things are being pushed and pulled around when you use the forward warp tool, which is this little finger guy in the top left hand corner. If you have a face that's recognizable enough as a face, then you have a crap ton more options available for editing the specific features of the face one by one by using the face icon on the left or the face aware liquify menu on the right. The eye section even has the left and right eye separated and sliders for each. Any changes you make that you don't like, you can use the reconstruct tool on the left to undo and restore the image to its original state. You also have a few other types to choose from if you want to twist, twirl, pucker, or bloat parts of the image instead of drag and push it around. The pucker and bloat tools are actually great things to use on complex patterns around clothing folds to sink in and puff out the pattern areas where they would be as they wrap and fold around, and I've used both of these tools for things like that a lot. Lastly, you have your freeze and thaw mask tools, which allow you to draw over an area you don't want to affect with a transform and isolate and preserve it. If you decide you want to be able to edit that section again, just use the thaw mask to get rid of the freeze mask. You can trigger the preview off and on by ticking the preview box at the bottom to see your changes versus your original, or by pressing the P key on your keyboard. There are mesh options you can change that I'm not going to get into, and you can choose to show the mesh or leave it off in the view options below at any time. You also have a show backdrop option that comes in handy if you're making changes to a single layer and need to see your background, or a draft you want to follow for the changes underneath it. All in all, the Liquify menu offers a crap ton of non-destructive editing options to choose from. Speaking of editing tools, let's move on to the various warp tools Photoshop has to offer now, starting with the Perspective Warp tool found in your Edit menu at the top. The Perspective Warp tool shouldn't be confused with your Transform or regular warp tools. This tool is useful for defining the perspective planes of a shape, object, or pattern and making those planes adhere to the perspective changes that you make. It works similarly to the Vanishing Point tool, but it's much less of a headache to use. In this instance, I have a pattern I want to wrap around her briefcase that I want to keep in the proper perspective, so I'm going to use this tool for it. I can see my object has two planes, so that's what I'm going to add with my Perspective Warp tool by clicking and dragging out the planes. Whatever you intend to warp with this tool needs to match the perspective of the thing you're warping first. So since my pattern is straight and front on originally, that's how I'm going to set up my two planes. When you're done, go ahead and tick the warp option at the top, and you'll now be able to use the pins to warp this pattern into the perspective of the object easily. Outside of patterns, buildings, and other things, this tool is also great to use to help you find tricky perspective for things like weapons and characters while you're drafting things out. The more planes you add, the more you'll be able to edit the perspective of a thing, so keep that in mind. Next, let's go over the basic warp tools found in the Edit menu at the top down in the Transform list. I'm not going to go over every single one since the Distort option allows you to do all of them, and that's what I have my Transform key command set to trigger. You'll notice there's a perspective warp here too, but unlike the perspective warp tool, this one will only affect a one-sided plane. Once you've picked a transform type, right-clicking it will bring up the menu options and you'll be able to change the type or go down to warp, which will load a transform mesh over your entire object to further warp it. This warp feature gives you a new list of changes you can apply to this mesh, like preset grids or the ability to make your own. The ability to add slices to your grid manually, which is insanely helpful if you have things you need to warp that are going in different directions, and a preset drop-down menu of various types of warps that a lot of people have used, including myself. These presets also allow you to add more areas to them by holding down the Alt key to position and clicking to place new divisions. You can move this warp mesh around by clicking anywhere, and you can even twist areas in different directions if you needed to. The final warp tool I'm going to go over is the Puppet Warp tool found in the Edit menu, and this is a tool I find myself using exclusively for more complex warps like heavily detailed embroidery or ropes in my pieces. This tool will create different mesh nets over your individual objects. You can choose to turn the view of the mesh on or off with the Show Mesh option at the top. You can also expand or shrink the mesh from the top if you needed to. This tool works by placing pins into your mesh to control where you want to move an object and what part of it you want to stay in place. This tool makes it easy to overlap objects, making a great choice for ropes, strings, and other things that would overlap. Also, since you can add pins by clicking on your object and delete pins by right-clicking them and selecting delete, it works 100 times better for complex transformations than the normal warp mesh tool would because it doesn't cause as much stretching and squishing to the entire thing. The fact that this tool isolates your individual objects and gives them their own mesh also makes moving them around on an individual basis much easier, whereas again, the regular warp mesh would use a blanket mesh over everything and affect it all at the same time. Puppet Warp also supports individual-based rotation transforms, meaning you can rotate your mesh object with a pin by selecting the pin and holding down the Alt key to trigger the rotation menu. This can also allow to non-destructively reposition entire fully painted body parts of your piece if you wanted to. It's an insanely powerful warp tool and one of my personal favorites Photoshop has in its set. The last thing I'm going to mention in this video is how to quickly correct the fuzziness and slight blur that happens to an area after a warp has been made to a rasterized layer. While the area is still selected, but after the warp has been applied, simply go up to your filter menu again and select sharpen from the sharpen menu, and this will rematch the quality of the pixels before they were warped with raster layers. It's a really easy fix, so I wanted to throw that out there. Lastly, Photoshop has something called the History Brush tool, which, much like Liquify's Reconstruct tool, can take changes made to a layer and erase them, restoring the layer back to an earlier stage if you ever need to do that. This tool can bypass the limitations set to the undo feature. It's not one of my favorite tools, but it's worth mentioning anyway. That's it for this video. Hopefully you have a better idea of what tools you can start using for making corrections and edits to your own art after watching this, and if you're interested in more software and art tutorials by me, you can find them all in my tutorials playlist on my channel. Later.